Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the third of our monthly talks for the Society of Army Historical Research. I'm Dudley Giles. I'm a member of the Society and have offered to put these talks on for the Society. The platform that we're using is perhaps now familiar to a number of you, but for those that are new to the platform, let me talk you around what you can see on your screen. In the top right hand corner you should see a grey lozenge with 4 buttons in it. The first button on the left will no doubt have a letter in it, probably the initial of your first name. The second button has an arrow going south from southwest to the northeast. If you click on that, it will bring your screen to your window to full screen. And if you click on it again, it will reduce it back to window size. And you may wish to work out which is better for your viewing. The third button is the familiar settings cogwheel. Now, Demio, the platform that we use, relies on the strength of the broadband connection at your end. So if you are having any problems with video or audio this evening, it will be down to the strength of your broadband connection. And you can test that if you like by clicking on the systems cogwheel, which will bring a drop-down menu. In the bottom right-hand corner of it should be a green link which says run test. And if you run that test, it will tell you what your broadband connection is doing this evening. If you're having any problems, then there are 3 immediate action drills that you can employ to solve them, and generally these work. The first is to refresh the page. That's easily said, but a number of people don't know how to refresh their page. But if you look to the top left-hand corner of your browser, you will see an incomplete circle with an arrow. If you click on that, that refreshes the page. If that doesn't solve the problems that you're having with video or audio, then try the second IA drill. And that involves just coming out of the browser and then rejoining using the same link that you joined this evening. And the third IA drill that you can employ if the first 2 don't work is to, and if you have the ability to do this, is to use a different browser. So if you're watching this in Chrome, then try using Safari or Microsoft Edge. Demio also works in Firefox, but I've found that most problems associated with video and audio occur when people are using a Firefox browser. So those are the 3 IA drills. If you're in the unfortunate situation where none of those work, then I'm afraid there's not much else I can do for you. But be assured that this session is being recorded, and everybody who has registered for the event this evening will automatically get a copy of the recording later on this evening, and certainly by first thing tomorrow morning. I stressed the issues that you might have, but let's be honest, most people don't have any issues at all with the platform. And the last button on the top right hand of your screen is an arrow pointing to the right from a bar. If you click on that, you will see that the chat box disappears. And if you don't want to be distracted by the chat box during Peter's talk, then you might wish to use that. When Peter has finished his presentation this evening, there will be a Q&A session which I will lead. And what we try to encourage you to do is to write your questions in the chat box as they occur to you this evening. That saves the difficulty of you rushing at the end to typing your questions. If Peter subsequently answers the question during his talk, then obviously I won't put the question to him. But writing the question as it occurs to you, we've found does save some time. So that's enough by way of introduction. I noticed from the chat box that a number of people are introducing themselves. And it's now time for me to introduce this evening's speaker. The Revd Dr Peter Howson is a Methodist minister who had a full career in the Army chaplaincy, rising to the dizzy heights of Deputy Chaplain General. And his last appointment was as the commandant, if you like, or of the Tri-Service Chaplaincy College at Amport. He's written many books on Army chaplaincy, and the subject of his talk this evening is an extremely interesting period for Army chaplaincy just after the Second World War and part of the reconstruction effort of post-war Germany. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Peter to join me on stage. If you'd like to come up, please, Peter. Now,
thank you, Dudley. I'll just make one small correction. Within the arcane structure of Army chaplaincy, I only made it to be an assistant chaplain general, never to the dizzy heights of deputy chaplain general. We have deputies and assistants at all levels, as far as I can see. But you're right, I was the first Army principal of what was then the Armed Forces Chaplaincy Centre at Amport House, which is now at Beckett House, part of the Defence Academy at Shrivelley.
I knew that I will get something wrong, Peter. So my first point was, what did I get wrong? So thank you for correcting me. Right. Peter has no slides this evening, so I don't have to do that. I'm going to take myself off the stage now. And when Peter's completed his talk, he will make that clear to me, and I will come back to conduct the question and answer session. I will also, in the chat box, put in reminders about the IA drills, if necessary, and also a reminder to ask your questions as they occur to you. But without any further ado, Peter, I'm leaving the station over to you.
Dudley, thank you very much indeed. Let me just remove the chat from my screen. Yeah, I was thinking about the title as I was preparing for this over the last week, and it occurred to me that it ought to be this: British Army chaplains in Germany in the summer of 1945, a help or a hindrance. And I shall come back to try and explain why I've chosen that title in a minute. But I wanted to begin by saying that when I was a theological student more years ago than I care to remember, there was somebody in the department at Cambridge of whom it was said that his lectures sounded like sermons and his sermons like lectures. At least they were different. I'm taking a slight risk that the same charge could be levelled against me this evening by beginning with a quote from St. Paul. He wrote to Christians in Corinth that they were, amongst other things, the unknown ones whom everybody knows. And it's always seemed to me that this is a wonderful description of the role of a British Army chaplain. To use another biblical image, they are at their best the salt in a dish, the thing that makes the food wonderful rather than just nice. And I wanted to start with this, not just to allow any latecomers to get settled before the main part of this lecture starts, but also because I think that this widespread working in the background, which is of the essence of the nature of Army chaplaincy, actually accounts for the difficulty in finding records. And because chaplains are everywhere, you have to go everywhere to look, to try and get some sort of overall picture, lest you concentrate on one or two and therefore have a rather skewed view. As I said, I'm going to talk mostly about the period between May and October 1945, when the war had come to an end and the post-war settlement was being put into place. It's important to note that in that post-war settlement, the only institution of any note, any size, any geographical significance that Germans were allowed to run were the churches. Everything else was run by what was called the Control Commission and divided up into the 4 zones where the Control Commission was under the responsibility of either the British, the Americans, the Russians, or the French. And I think it's important to note that this independence given to the German churches, because it directly impacted on chaplains and also on their relationship with both the rest of the army and with the wider Control Commission. And because there were differing views about how they performed that role, particularly in the rather confused period of that summer of 1945, I have called the talk Help or Hindrance. The unique view of chaplains, the unique role of chaplains rather, was viewed in different ways by different people. So I'm going to talk about a couple of instances where they were seen as a hindrance, and then one where they came to be used by the Control Commission as a help. And then finally, I will end with a note about one specific instance where chaplains were heavily involved and were definitely seen by most, if not all, as a help. Some of the material for this talk comes from the research that I did for my book on Britain and the German churches in this period between 1945 and 1950, when the Control Commission was active, a book that was published by the Boydell Press last summer. And I'd also like to just express publicly my thanks to David Blake, the curator of the Royal Army Chaplains Museum, especially in the very busy period up to yesterday. Because yesterday saw the royal opening of the new museum based just outside the Beckett House gate at the Defence Academy at Shrivenham. David's been very kind to me, and I'm extremely grateful for all the help that he's given to me. It's a wonderful new museum. If you are in the area, do make the opportunity to make contact and go and have a look at it. It tells the story of faith in the forces in an imaginative and very modern way, and is highly recommended. But just let me come back to that summer of 1945 and set the scene as far as chaplaincy was concerned. The Royal Army Chaplains Department was essentially 2 parallel command structures and 2 cap badges. But they weren't both one and the same thing, since those wearing the Jewish cap badge came under the administration of what was known as the Unified Department, and some wearing the Christian badge belonged to the Catholic Church and were administered separately from the remainder. So there were, in a sense, 2 parallel offices within the various levels of administration of the army, and confusing it was, and confusing it remained until about 15 years ago. The problems and opportunities faced each of the groups in different ways, but I will generally speak just of chaplains. There were, of course, at that time no women serving as chaplains in the army, unlike, of course, the Royal Air Force. But there were female chaplains assistants, and they soon arrived in Germany, but after this period, to serve the needs of the women's forces. And indeed, the cover picture which I chose for my book is of a group of chaplains and chaplains assistants in uniform sitting around a German pastor and theologian, Martin Niemöller, at the church house in Iserlohn sometime slightly after the period that I'm talking about, when such a thing would not have been possible. There are 2 hindrances, 2 instances of hindrances where chaplains were seen as a hindrance to the army. The first really concerns the policy towards Germans, and indeed then what would happen if there was a armed resistance on any particular scale to the Allied occupation. So the first of them, as early as the summer of 1944, a policy of what came to be called non-fraternisation was announced as the stance that the army would take, and the Allies would take, towards all German civilians. Now, this, of course, posed a problem for chaplains, for whom involvement with the local population was a normal part of their operation. Indeed, for Catholic chaplains, who owed the same allegiance to the Pope in Rome as Catholics everywhere, it was almost axiomatic. Since the Normandy landings in June 1944, Catholic chaplains had enjoyed the hospitality of the Catholic countries in which they had been fighting. They had used the local churches for their masses and shared with the local population. Protestant chaplains had been slightly less welcome in that they were refused permission, as they had been in World War I, to use Catholic churches for any of their services. And they therefore had to continue to make use of barns or cinemas or whatever other buildings happened to be available. But they still enjoyed a good working relationship with the local people. Now in Germany, this relationship was going to be denied to them. And this was made clear by a specific order from the highest level. An order from Eisenhower's HQ promulgated in March 1945 made this absolutely clear. And let me quote: "Whilst maintaining a sympathetic appreciation of the complex religious issues involved, the Supreme Commander believes that the high ideals to which we have dedicated ourselves and the attainment of the future peace of the world are ends to which our religious institutions wholeheartedly subscribe, and to which the clergy give their support." So far, probably fairly straightforward and acceptable. It then goes on to say, "To attain these ends, the policy of non-fraternisation is deemed essential and must apply to chaplains and religious workers." I find that actually quite surprising. I find it even more surprising that the British churches didn't in any sense object to it. Maybe they didn't hear about it, but it seems to have been allowed to pass. Of course, it did affect Catholic chaplains more obviously. And it's no surprise that Father Stableton, who was the senior of the Catholic chaplains at 21 Army Group, should have sought to explain the ruling to his flock. And he wrote this to Catholic chaplains: "It is expected that, due to the bond of a common faith, a strong appeal will be made to British Catholic chaplains by many of the German clergy who were anti-Nazi. This and the well-known treatment of the Catholic Church in Germany by the Nazi Party may be used as a plea for preferential treatment and the securing of privileges. We must be on our guard in this respect, and as the chaplain must give a lead to his men. Any relaxation of the strict order of non-fraternisation would be open to the gravest suspicion and misunderstanding. The situation that faces us is one that is strange and new and will make a big demand on our tact. Our watchword should be correctness, firmness, and politeness." Difficult to enforce. And there's no doubt at all that SHAPE saw chaplains as a potential threat almost, certainly a hindrance within the implementation of this policy of non-fraternisation. Not least because clergy across nations had had relationships prior to the start of the war, and indeed the British churches, led largely by Bishop George Bell of Chichester, had maintained close links with what was called the Confessing Church and those who had stood out against Hitler, as well as, of course, noting that there were these Catholic leaders who had opposed certain aspects of Nazi policy. And one of those who had done so was the Bishop of Munster, the Archbishop von Galen, August von Galen. He was on the Gestapo's list when the Germans won the war for immediate extermination. He, of course, had spoken out in 1941 against the policy of the removal, the extermination of those seen to be unfit to be members of society, largely those with mental or physical disabilities, who were quietly, in some cases, being exterminated. And he spoke from the pulpit very, very angrily against it. It is worth noting that neither he nor any other of the Catholic bishops, as far as I could see, spoke in public about a much bigger Nazi policy, which was for the extermination of the Jewish community. But Gallen was noted as the Lion of Munster, and his sermons were actually used, turned into leaflets, and were some of those that the RAF dropped on the German population. He found himself at times at loggerheads with the British administration. But there is a lovely story, and it shows exactly how non-fraternisation could be interpreted and what it could mean. It relates to a meeting between a Father Murphy, a Catholic chaplain, and von Gallen in his study in Munster. It was recounted by von Gallen's German biographer. One Saturday evening, Father Murphy grew so strongly aware of the bond of a common humanity between them that he made free to offer the bishop a little medicine in the form of a bottle of whiskey. It touched the bishop very much that in the midst of this tiring and exacting work, such very human sympathy was shown him. He asked Father Murphy to drink the first glass with him. When, however, he did not succeed in persuading him, he had recourse to a stratagem and declared with a slight smile, "Father, I cannot accept your remedy unless you drink the first glass. Since we are enemies, you must convince me before I do so that the drink is not dangerous or poisonous." Amidst a hearty laugh on both sides, the bishop poured out the whiskey, and Father Murphy raised his glass. There were, for all people on the ground, ways of finding their way round the policy of non-fraternisation, particularly if it was something that you didn't agree with. One of the problems about making representations at SHAFE headquarters for chaplains, and one of the ways in which I think also they came to be seen as a hindrance, was that chaplaincy was and remains a national responsibility. There was thus no chaplains branch as such, as part of the structure at the SHAFE HQ, which could argue the case that chaplains should be exempted from the order on non-fraternisation. This lack was also obvious when plans were being drawn up as to how the army would react in the case of armed resistance. We look back from a position where we now know that there was, to all intents and purposes, after May 1945, no real opposition in support of the Nazi regime. This was not necessarily obviously going to be true at the time. And I think we need to put ourselves in the position of those who were in Germany, having fought through countries where there were strong, of varying amounts, resistance groups to the previous Nazi regime. And on the basis of that, there was a certain expectation that there might be such resistance within Germany. And so one of the things that the headquarters did was to create an op order called ECLIPSE as a way of organising the troops to meet any such resistance. But of course, within that, because there was no chaplains branch, there was no place for chaplains. The Assistant Chaplain General, who was the senior chaplain in the 8th Army, John Steele, used the opportunity of the creation of the plans to set out what the size of the Royal Army Chaplains Department should be in Germany post the end of the war. And he actually wrote an order to sit alongside Op ECLIPSE. He said that some 300 chaplains would be needed, 60 Catholic, 30 from the Church of Scotland and the English Free Churches, and the remainder, that's 210, would be Anglican. And they would be distributed across the whole army. He, as the ACG, would be at the army headquarters with a single staff chaplain. And there would be then chaplains with army troops and with the medical units, including general hospitals. Although, as nobody knew quite what they were going to be, it was a little uncertain. There would be 5 at the next tier down at the core districts, 4 core districts and 1 mobile reserve. And then 240 chaplains in the 4 core districts, that's 60 in each of the core districts. There would, in addition, because the responsibility was expected to extend across the border, be 16 chaplains assigned to Denmark. And last 6 chaplains would act as train guards. I think that would probably train chaplains rather than train guards, because I thought of chaplains, despite the love affair between the clergy and the railways, the thought of chaplains waving green flags is slightly horrific. There was, of course, no requirement in the end for the operation to be put into action, but the distribution that he laid out did, however, serve as a guide into the way in which chaplains were to be distributed across the British zone. But of course, there was a reality that the chaplains did inevitably interact with the local clergy. And that meant that by July 1945, there was a need to recognise and formalise what was happening, lest the chaplains on the ground became too great a hindrance to what the British element of the Control Commission Germany was trying to do. Chaplains could help, but the question was how. The British had set up a small cell called the Religious Affairs Branch within a much larger education branch, which was tasked with the job of starting again, effectively, a Nazi-free German education system from kindergarten through primary school and high schools and into universities. An interesting book by David Phillips of Oxford University has just recently been published called Educating the Germans, about the work of the education branch. The Control Commission headquarters was established at Lübeck, and it's interesting that the last place that the Royal Army Chaplains Department left from Germany in the summer of 1919 was Church House at Lübeck, a building which almost certainly would have been well known to members of the Control Commission. There was to be a whole series of meetings in June, July and early August 1945 between the Army and the Control Commission to try and work out both who had precedence, the Control Commission or Army chaplains, and how they would interact. And there's no doubt at all that members of the Control Commission saw chaplains as a hindrance because they were working at local level. Certainly the Protestant chaplains, many of them had requisitioned German churches for their own use and therefore had regular contact with local Lutheran or Reformed clergy. And they were the people to whom many Germans, particularly through the churches, would go with all sorts of questions. So they became, as it were, the focal point, particularly where the Control Commission was thinly spread on the ground. And there became an issue as to how this should be worked out. Eventually, a policy had to be agreed. And I described it as this in my book. The formal policy that set out the relationship of chaplains to the Control Commission was published on the 4th of September 1945. Appearing as Education Control Instruction number 19, headed Cooperation of Service Chaplains with MilGov in the Control of German Church Affairs, unquote. It indicated that 19 chaplains, 10 Protestant and 9 Catholic, were to be available to the Commission. One of each would work at the province level. That's probably roughly now what we would call the equivalent of the German land. And the remainder as closely to the Catholic hierarchy and the heads of the Protestant churches as possible. They were to work part-time in an advisory role so that the Commission might have, and here's a quote, the benefit of expert advice on church matters, unquote. And the chaplains were to act in a liaison capacity between the Commission and church leaders. It's interesting, of course, because he actually seems to support one of the charges that's regularly made against chaplains and has so often been made against chaplains by sociologists in the middle part of the last century under the heading of role tension. Something that Mike Snape, the historian of British Army chaplaincy, has vigorously sought to counter. But here we do have an example of a compromise being worked out where chaplains are seen to be attempting to work to two masters, to the Control Commission and to the chaplains hierarchy within the army. Sadly, we don't know very much about the way in which the scheme was put into operation. It is possible that lovely story about Father Murphy and Bishop von Gallen is actually part of his work as one of the Catholic chaplains assigned to the Control Commission. But things moved on very rapidly, and the army distanced itself as much as possible from the work of the military government, and concentrated on making sure that the Control Commission was in the foreground, because the Control Commission was seen as a civilian organisation, and the army wanted to, as indeed the British government policy became, that the army should not be seen to be the controlling factor, although they would be supplying a certain amount of the help. There is, of course, one case where chaplains acted as a significant help, although even in this case there is a degree of feeling that by some people that they were more of a hindrance than a help. And that was at Belsen, the one large concentration camp liberated by the British. And in a recent article in the March edition of Jewish Historical Studies, Jonathan Lewis, who's recently completed a doctoral thesis on Jewish chaplaincy in the British forces, Jonathan Lewis has explored the experience of Jewish chaplains in the days, weeks and months that followed the liberation of Belsen in April 1945. As Rob Thompson has shown, there were other chaplains at Belsen as well. And the testimonies of all of these chaplains are amongst the largest collection of chaplains' memoirs from that summer of 1945. I'd like to quote one example used by Jonathan Lewis, and that's part of the memories of Leslie Hardman, who was the Jewish chaplain for 8 Corps. And he wrote this: virtually unsupported at the outset, this is Jonathan Lewis writing about Leslie Hardman. Virtually unsupported at the outset, Hardman's achievements were remarkable. The very presence of a fellow Jew and a rabbi with the Star of David insignia in the British Army gave heart to many inmates. Hardman spent long hours talking with them and visited and fed the seriously sick. The speed and efficiency of the British response has been subsequently much debated. Constantly frustrated by what he saw as ponderous British bureaucracy, and realising sooner than most what needed to be done, Hardman rallied against what he saw as the army's dithering and delay and lack of progress in the early days. Even then, chaplains could by some in the army bureaucracy be seen as a hindrance rather than a help. There are a number of other instances, people who've written their memoirs, and including a little bit about that summer of 1945. And I'd just like to quote from a couple of those before I bring this talk to a close. Those of you who have read Aftermath, the novel, or seen the film with Keira Knightley will know a little bit about the Control Commission and its work in Hamburg. There was a British Army chaplain in Hamburg, Padre Robertson. He was from the Church of Scotland, and he took over a Lutheran church in Hamburg. But one service not in the church started in one way and came to a very different conclusion. Was he being a help or a hindrance, one wonders? And I tell the story here. One Sunday, I decided to hold an open-air service beside the large German war memorial, as it was the most suitable place, situated in the centre of the main thoroughfare. I never intended it to be a memorial service, but as we commenced the service with a hymn, word got round that British soldiers, led by an army chaplain, were conducting a memorial service in honour of the German servicemen who had fallen in the war. Soon hundreds of German war widows crowded round. Sometime before this, several thousand German war widows had staged a protest meeting against British troops being quartered in their homes. Suddenly, 2 big German policemen hurried towards us, thinking that this was another protest meeting. But when they saw me in my army chaplain's uniform and the British soldiers with me, they went right up to the front of the gathering and reverently bowed their heads in honour of their fallen comrades. The German widows were pleased that their husbands had a memorial service in their honour. After this, there were no more protest meetings, and our servicemen were made welcome. We sang together an appropriate hymn of praise, "Thy kingdom come, O God." Further south in Hanover, Leslie Skinner, a Methodist chaplain, somebody who wrote a book about his time with the Show of Foresters, Show Rangers Yeomanry, the Band of Brothers of James Holland's novel, from the D-Day landings onwards, called The Man Who Worked on Sundays, ended up being appointed the senior chaplain in Hanover district. And he wrote this, because there was a need to try and get children, hundreds of children, off the streets and to restart some form of education. The Brigadier's response was to summon a meeting of the religious leaders of all the various denominations in Hanover, varying from the Roman Catholic and Lutheran through to Pentecostal fringe elements at the other. This was certainly the first ever ecumenical meeting of all the churches in Hanover. I was present and appointed by the Brigadier to be the recipient of information as to materials, etc., required, all of which were virtually non-existent in the city, and not all that easy to supply from any army or military government sources. In a very short time, military government took over completely, and I dropped out. And finally, a chaplain who was to go on to be the warden of the church house in the First Corps district, the Revd Arc Leni, vented his feelings about being a chaplain in Germany and dealing with Germans. There may well be a religious revival in Germany, but it will mean nothing at all, nothing, as a force to unite mankind, for their religion is even further from true Christianity than ours. We have not forgiven, and they have not repented. They are sorry with a human sorrow, and they are condemned by a human condemnation, the judgment not of God, but of Poles, of Czechs, and Russians, and Greeks, and Dutch, and our part cannot be played. Somehow the play has gone wrong again, and someone's missed their cue. He ought to be weeping there. He is weeping, don't you see? And we wait in the wings, waiting for our cue, waiting. There isn't anything to do any more than there was for Christ to do when he wept over Jerusalem. The moment is gone. I don't think it will ever return. If there was no word of regret or repentance over Belsen and Buchenwald, there will hardly be one now, when it is quite respectable to fraternize, when we shake hands and make it up without anyone saying he is sorry. Indeed, the deep momentary embarrassment mankind has chosen its old persistent uneasiness. And I make no apologies for ending what is essentially a theological statement at the end, because the biggest task facing the Allies, the German population, and particularly the Germans, and into the middle of which was this question about how do you make sense of what has happened? How do you move forward on the basis of what has been happening in as a result of the Nazi regime over the last particularly 6 years, and particularly in terms of the extermination of so many millions of people and the concentration on the removal of the Jewish population. And indeed, it's a question which still remains, in a sense, not fully answered. The British chaplains had to, in some ways themselves, as we've seen in the example of Belsen, to come to terms with what they would have to say about it. But by doing so, of course, they got themselves involved in situations where others within the army and indeed within the Control Commission might have wished that they had stayed clear of. And so I've no doubts, really, that for many in Germany in the summer of 1945, chaplains were seen as a hindrance to some of the things that they were doing, as equally there were many individual soldiers, many in command, and many in the German population who saw the chaplains as a considerable help in that time of huge difficulty and problems. Dudley, thank you very much, and I'm prepared to answer questions.
Thank you, Peter, very much. It's not the first time I've listened to you talk on this subject, and I still find it fascinating. We've got one question at the moment in the audience, and before I pose it to you, I encourage other questions from the audience. But perhaps I can put one for myself. During your research, Peter, did you come across evidence of disquiet within the chaplaincy itself about the policy that their leaders, if you like, had imposed upon them, and were representations made to say that this is wrong or it should be done in a different manner?
I think the difficulty was, as I've pointed out, that because there was a no chaplains branch at SHAFE, it was actually quite difficult for chaplains' voices to be heard at that level. And I think I've been trying to interpret that quote from Father Stableton as when he's writing to the Catholic chaplains, telling them to obey the order, whether he's doing it tongue in cheek or not, whether he actually believes that it's the right thing to do, because of course, the more you uncovered things like Belsen, the more people's feelings were changed, and there were those who became, why should we have anything to do with the population that has supported this particular action? It's very interesting that the Catholic bishops were going to issue a statement in early June about, as it were, complicity and, as it were, expressing their sorrow for what had happened. And just before it was about to be issued, the Pope issued a encyclical really about what has happened in the war, in which he specifically praised the German bishops and German Christians and said that they had provided most of the opposition to Hitler and that there were a whole series of martyrs. At which point it seemed to be inappropriate to say we got it wrong and we didn't do things, if the Holy Father was saying, how wonderful you'd all been. And that has, to some extent, led an ongoing debate within the Catholic Church in Germany as to what their role was. And as I pointed out, that von Gallen, who was lauded in Britain in 1941 and right the way through to the end of the war, as a result of his sermons against the policy towards those with physical or mental disabilities, does not seem to have said anything, as far as I know, about policies towards the Jews. And so there is this kind of ambivalence. And I think that ambivalence is expressed within the British chaplains as well, and would clarify over time. But I mean, there's one Catholic chaplain who had served at Belsen shortly after, because he was attached to a hospital, and the hospital was sent there. And then he was moved up to Diepholz to look after troops stationed in the area south of Bremen. And he writes there of how friendly people were and how nice it was to get to know the Germans. And he doesn't seem in any sense to hold them responsible for what he'd seen at Belsen. So there is a kind of unclear thing that has not yet, I think, been fully teased out.
I can sort of empathise with that, in that in Bosnia and Croatia, I was dealing with so-called policemen who I knew had blood on their hands, and yet I still had to mentor them and sort of try to get them to go on the right path, if you like, in the future. So it's a supremely difficult task, I think.
And of course, it's utterly relevant to today, because what happened on the 24th of February didn't end on the 30th or the 28th of February, but it's still continuing, and it's continuing in a way which nobody could have foreseen then. The question of what happens when the fighting finishes, both in Russian-occupied and in non-Russian occupied parts of the Ukraine, is a very live issue. Because clearly there are those in Ukrainian, the Ukraine state that remains a sovereign, who are seen as having cooperated with the Russians. And this is going to be an issue which people need to be thinking about as soon as possible, both within the among the combatants, but I think also within the wider international community. If we send aid to them, we need to make sure that we help that the reconstruction takes place properly. And yeah.
I can always rely on Ewan to pose a question from the audience, and his is, were the chaplains all model examples, or are you aware of any serious disciplinary issues?
I know that one chaplain was court-martialed later in 1945 for liberating large quantities of alcohol not by himself on House to 8, but with a number of people, I think, from the Control Commission, and was found guilty, but was subsequently pardoned. I've no other evidence of, you may know more about this because from the policeman's point of view, no. I mean, certainly there were chaplains who found it had great difficulty coming to terms with what they'd seen. And there were examples, certainly I think, of PTSD. I don't know of any disciplinary issues. They may well have got away with things that they wouldn't. And indeed, of course, you know, the biggest disciplinary issue would have been in May and June, fraternizing with the Germans. And how do you define? I mean, if you go to Herr Pfarrer Schmidt because you've requisitioned his church and you need to know about how the heating and lighting works, and you have a bottle of wine with him, is that fraternization or is it requisitioning? You know, the rules are very difficult at times, and there's no evidence actually of any chaplains having been, as far as I know, charged in any way with breaking the non-fraternization, as they were, of course, for other, particularly junior. There were a number of cases where they were actually subject to either local disciplinary or indeed, I think, even court-martialed, and it became a very sore point because the orders remained in existence right, I think, until September when they were finally revoked, and it could be a good way of getting your own back on somebody you didn't like.
Following on from that, John's made the observation that in the Gulf 1990-91, his chaplain became quite adept at scrounging, probably due to his ability to free range. Are you aware of similar roles being adopted by chaplains at the end of the war in Germany?
No, is the short answer, and certainly nothing like as much as I was aware of it in terms of chaplains on the line of march. So chaplains in Normandy were adept at getting butter and eggs and other goodies for their troops. I think two reasons possibly. One is possibly chaplains might never have committed this to paper, because scrounging in 1945 Germany actually usually meant taking something that was valuable rather than something you needed. I mean, it's interesting because we have to remember that one of the administrative instructions that was given to the British was that they were not to live off the land. That because the food crisis was so bad in the British sector, bear in mind the British sector was largely heavily industrialized, and that part of Germany had always relied on wheat from the east, which was either now in Poland or under Russian control, and the wheat was being sent back to the Soviet Union. So there was a huge food crisis in the British zone, and the British insisted that therefore the army and the Control Commission would not live on German rations. They would live on their own thing, and so actually to do what you did in France, which was to go and barter for eggs or whatever, was seen to be not the thing you should do. So I suspect that there was less scrounging. I won't say it didn't happen, because I won't say it didn't happen in Bosnia either. But I think, there was less involvement. It was more scrounging for the Germans. I mean, there's a lot of evidence of chaplains using engineer stores to help Germans rebuild their churches, or getting paper and pens, as it were, for people who want to set up classrooms. So it's scrounging on behalf of the Germans rather from them, I think.
Thank you. One last question, and it's from Carol. To what degree did chaplains have difficulty in adhering to Christian principles teaching and following the non-fraternisation policy? I think you've covered that quite a bit, but is there anything else you want to expand on there?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to quantify, really, and to some extent, each chaplain's, the policy had been set out. I don't think, from what I can see of the records, that the chaplaincy branches ever particularly enforced it very strongly. I don't think they looked into what individual chaplains were doing on the ground very, very clearly. And each chaplain was individual. And I say some chaplains were heavily influenced by what they saw when they went to Belsen, others less so. And others believed that the Germans needed to be put, helped back into the circle of nations. I think American chaplains, it's a very different story with American chaplains, because America had ended the war with FDR's policy, influenced by Morgenthau, or effectively a Carthaginian peace, where Germany would be returned to being an agrarian country. This, of course, was anathema to Churchill, because Germany had been a major trading partner with the United Kingdom, as of course it still is, and therefore the thought of the Ruhr being turned back to agriculture, and therefore not able to buy British goods, and indeed not able to supply Britain with some of the things it wanted, was completely wrong. And so there was a sense in which I think sometimes the chaplains were feeling that SHAPE, run by Americans, was adopting an American attitude to what should happen after the war, and that they themselves wanted it to go in a slightly different direction, and therefore wanted to create a state that was going to be much more able to take its place in the circle of nations.
Thank you. Peter, thank you once again for your illuminating talk this evening. I'm going to draw stumps on that slightly, but if I've set this up correctly, when I close down the session this evening, it should take you to a page which will enable you to register for next month's talk, which is being given by Dr. Andrew Banford, who is the new Honorary Secretary of the Society. And I think I failed to mention that until this year's AGM, Peter had been our Honorary Secretary. He is giving a talk on the Peninsular War, on horses and horsemanship. And that's just to demonstrate that these talks are not always focused on the 20th century, but in line with the Society's policies and guidelines, we deal in a large area of history. So once again, thank you again, Peter, for your talk this evening. I do encourage people to go and see the museum outside Beckett entrance to the Defence Academy in Shrivenham. If it's anything like the museum, the perfectly formed museum that was at Amport House, I think it will be a wonderful thing to see. So I say good night and see you all hopefully next month.
Thank you.